From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Hi again, welcome to the Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Well, if you're somebody who enjoys politics, and if you watch this show, you probably are. What a week it's been, eh? Here in Chicago, Mayor Emanuel put together his second full budget, and this one's a big one. It's $6.5 billion, but the deficit hole was more manageable this year, they say, and the mayor confidently predicts he can bring everything into balance with some layoffs, some changes to how health care is delivered to city employees, and just that optimistic view of how much better everything's going to be in the economy next year when President Barack Obama gets reelected, right? He also found some wiggle room to hire some more police officers and some forestry workers, which we're going to need to cut down all those ash trees, unfortunately. Ed Gardner seems to have reawakened the old style of activism on the South Side. Governor Quinn and our mayor continue to snipe at each other, and the Chicago Tribune has brand new owners. And since we consider anything that goes on with Barack Obama to be a local news story here on this show, we're watching with some amazement as how the polls continue to slide downward after that performance at the debate last week. In fact, we might be seeing the biggest drop in popularity this close to an election since the whole idea of TV debates got started with JFK. So here to help us with that national perspective that's local is NPR's Cheryl Corley from the Chicago Bureau of NPR. Once again, thanks, Cheryl. Thanks for coming back. Yes, indeed. And our old buddy Thom Clark is back here from the Community Media Workshop. Tom, always great to have you on the show.
Great to see you both again.
So, should we start with Mayor Emanuel's budget? It's miraculous. A year ago, it looked like all hell was breaking loose. We're going to have to turn off the lights and pretty much give ourselves back to England or something. This was not going to work. And within 1 year, he's gotten us to the point that we had just a small deficit, and he erased that with some speed cameras, apparently. So,
well, I don't know if it's small. I wouldn't call 300 million exactly small.
It feels small when you're talking about the 80 billion that the state owes in pensions and everything. 300 million just seems so irrelevant and tiny.
Right. We'll see what happens if all these other things don't come through and the property bill goes up or whatever.
Oh, you're not saying that the speed cameras are not going to work now, are you?
Well, we have a number of suggested revenue builders that some aldermen are calling optimistic. The mayor has said, leading even up to this budget, that no new property taxes, no new fees.
No new fees.
I mean, it's really good news for Chicagoans. You look at your tax bill, at least the city portion will remain the same.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, okay,
but I wonder
if Emanuel, that's the only part he controls.
That's the only part that he controls, sort of.
Yeah.
But the suggestion that we have all of these other things that are going to bring in a lot of revenue in order to offset this $300 million deficit, you kind of wonder if all of that money is actually going to come in. For example, advertisements on buildings or city sponsorships that the mayor kind of floated in his last budget and expected millions to come in.
He's got like 15 in there, 15 million or something this time?
A little bit like $18 million. And it didn't do very well at all.
First time somebody saw an ad on the Michigan Avenue Bridge or wherever it was, and people freaked out. And,
so some of the revenue estimates might be a little or somewhat optimistic.
Or another way to look at it is 30 million from cameras, which aren't yet operational, and there are a couple legal issues still.
A couple, yeah.
You got to capture kids in the picture in order to assess the fine. Because
it's worth spending a moment on that. The purpose of these is to protect the children around the schools, right? It's not to collect money.
So if you're speeding, you can only get a ticket if there's a kid in the picture. Otherwise, it's just speeding, and a cop has to catch you.
Right.
I mean, that's the interesting legal rub here, is that the law in which this was built, a school safety thing, actually requires that the documentation for assessing the fine show a kid at risk from your speeding. Yes.
So there's an entrepreneurial opportunity here. You could be a job creator. You could rent your kids out to stand on the corner.
I think this could be part of the walk to work routine.
But then you'd have
except
to
it's walk to school.
Of some sort from the city, correct?
Oh, so you're such a Chicago girl. Right. Yeah, everybody's got to get a piece.
But when you consider that's 10% of the $300 million deficit, when the total property taxes collected are only paying for pension and debt service. Not a single policeman or fireman, much less school teacher who's in a different part of the property tax bill, is covered by the city's corporate share of the property taxes. Mark Brown pointed out a couple years ago, he covered something else this morning. I think most taxpayers don't realize how hemmed in someone like the mayor and his budget office really is. In a $6 to $8 billion economic experience, depending on which part of the budget you want to count here as a total, a $30 million new revenue source from cameras that are not yet proven really is a drop in a bucket, and there's a lot of wishful thinking, particularly since the elephant in the room, which the mayor acknowledged, and heavy editorial writer this morning also, is the pension crisis, because we haven't come close to solving that one, and it's labor negotiations, contracts, everything else are still very much up in the air and in play on that.
Well, the august Chicago Tribune editorial board is just all aflutter this morning because, you know, this is the thing. The state, the legislature hasn't even been able to tackle the state pensions, let alone find the time to deal with the changes that Emanuel wants to make in the city pensions. And you'd have to be a wild-eyed optimist to believe that that's going to happen anytime soon. And after all, it doesn't really kick in for 2 more years, so let's just party on, right?
Yeah, the big pension elephant in the room really hits in a couple of years or so. But it's huge, and I think that, you know, the mayor's floor leader, Alderman Patrick O'Connor, said, you know, if it comes to the point where nothing really is done, you're going to have a situation, and the mayor said in his budget report that, you know, we'll have to increase property taxes by 150%. You'll have everybody like fleeing Chicago, you know.
Well, I mean, in a way, it's kind of the Chicago version of what the federal government is facing with the driving over the cliff thing that's about to happen to them. I mean, it's almost too horrible to contemplate what will happen in Chicago if this isn't resolved in some way. But of course, the resolution is not an easy one either, because they're talking about making all the city employees pay a lot more, joining the system much later. And a lot of, you know, there's a lot of sacrifice to be made there too.
Well, you know, it was really interesting during the budget address how the mayor gave a shout out to the labor unions. Right?
SEIU gets a pat in the back, and ASME's knocked, and it's
it was like, hey guys, you know, I got a couple of unions here who did really, you know, they really came to the table and they really kicked in here.
Did he mention the CTU? I don't think I heard him.
Never quite came up, except
well, he didn't have a lot of time.
So these revenue increases are for the kids. I mean,
come to the table. Come to the table, police and firemen. You know, the big chunk of the budget.
Those of you who were running along honking your horns on the hook and ladders as you were watching the teachers in their red shirts, come to the table. Let's see what we can work out.
Yeah, I mean, because it's really going to be an issue. Because they are the bulk of the operating budget and receive the bulk of the pension share.
Well, I mean, you know, the Sun Times has this handy sort of blue and green chart here, and one of the things that you pointed out, Tom, is that the general financing requirements for expenditures like debt service, employee health care, and all that, that's 3.2 of the $6 billion right there, half. It's just gone right off the top. And you know, the cost of public service, the public safety is another $2 billion of that. So there's only about $1 billion of the 6 left by the time you've taken out debt service and what we're paying for basically police and fire. I mean, it's more than that, but public safety.
But Ken, you'll appreciate this. One of the things we're going to finally get citywide is recycling. I mean, a true recycling program.
Well,
after how many years?
It will be very interesting to see how that works and see how it works out, because
it appears that some administrative changes in work rules, like the gridding of garbage collection, have in fact come into play and have saved money and are more efficient. And, you know, hats off to the city bureaucrats that follow the mayor's directives on that and have started to pull that off.
Yeah.
Well, those are the structural changes that he was talking about.
I don't think we'll see those kind of willingness on the part of public safety
police
first
and fire
responders who are looking to get theirs now. The teachers
it is,
theirs.
Tom, I think
tough.
you raise a very interesting point, because I know in the 10 years that I worked with the city, that conversation was constantly being had about why do we do garbage this way? We're the only city that does this, where, you know, you'll have a gerrymandered ward and trucks have to run in and out, and, you know, just do it and make Ashland Avenue the border, for God's sake.
Well, it's interesting.
It worked. I mean, it appears to have been a good solution.
I think it really took having a new mayor, though, to make that happen, because
I agree.
It really was such
Yeah.
an entrenched practice,
Right,
and
right.
you know, political, and
Right.
you had to take care of folks, and so you had to have somebody new
Right.
kind of make those
Now,
changes.
the issues with police and fire, though, are more complicated because they're more emotional. I mean, people really don't care if their ward soup is picking up the garbage, or if the guy from, you know,
They
two,
would if
2
it
miles
didn't
away.
happen.
Well, that's
But
right.
yes.
That's right. But there's something a little bit different when a battalion commander tells you that if I don't have 5 guys on a rig, my guys are going to die out there in a fire, or your house is going to burn down more quickly, or whatever it is. It's a whole lot. The stakes are higher, so they're going to be able to make a more emotional case, and it's going to be very interesting to watch.
Now, you in your opening used an adjective that I want to edit. You referred to the city hiring more cops.
Ah,
And
yes.
indeed,
Well,
they are hiring replacement cops. The actual number of cops continues to drop because of attrition, and this has been another point of contention with the unions,
I stand
as well
totally
as the
corrected.
public perception that we need more cops,
Right,
even
right.
though overall crime has been dropping precipitously
Right.
for a couple of decades now.
Right, right.
And if there is in fact a correlation between number of police on the street and crime rate, well, we know that didn't necessarily affect the murder rate this year, which is up,
Right.
but overall crime continues to precipitously drop, and somehow there needs to be a little more education, I think, going on both sides. I understand where the union self-interest is to add more cops, but indeed what's really going on is that through attrition, there are fewer cops in the street, and
Absolutely
the mayor's
right.
making a commitment to at least hire new replacements
Right,
and
right.
keep
for
the level
those.
the same.
Right.
Yeah. But whether or not we need additional police beyond whatever that theoretical point was, let's call it the day of Mayor Daley's last day in office or something, whether we need more than that number is a really debatable point.
Yes. And that's going to be a big issue during the
And not to make
negotiations.
Yeah, it
too
is.
fine a point on this, there was the discussion about reviving community policing.
Right,
As
right.
someone who worked closely on that issue 20 years ago, we never really had full-fledged community
That's for
policing.
sure.
And once CAPS was implemented, cops who were in that program looked to get out because they could not advance in the ranks the way cops traditionally did,
Yeah.
because they weren't making arrests in the traditional way. Now, you can see the minutia I'm getting into and
No,
the
no,
difficulty in
that's the important-
explaining
right.
the public policy and taxation implications for this. But in fact, if there's an effort to really implement community policing, I'm convinced we'd see even more community engagement and an impact on the crime rate.
Right.
But the way cops get evaluated will have to be changed, or they won't stay in the system. It's seen as a social work placement where you don't get credit for making arrests, and therefore you can advance. And unless that changes, you're not going to have the workforce on the police department really embracing community policing.
I think it's pretty clear that the police department, at its core, never really embraced the concept of community policing and sort of resisted it, and essentially allowed it, as Mayor Emanuel's pointed out, his administration has pointed out, allowed it to just become like a big old bureaucracy. And that's kind of where it is today, and it needs to be shooken up.
And so he's talking about shifting it, putting it into the districts itself. So it will be interesting to
Yeah.
see if those kind of, again, structural changes actually occur.
So what you'll get is some districts will embrace it fully and it'll work well, and other districts will just throw it in a closet in the back and you'll never hear from it again.
Might be.
That's most
might
likely
end up
what will
being.
happen. So anyway, we have a budget proposal that appears not to be terribly controversial, that appears to be building on some of the strengths from last year, and congratulations to the mayor. He managed to pull this one off. However, he did do it by eliminating any semblance of public input in the process, which is something that I just can't figure out if I have an opinion about this or not, because I mean, we all have spent a few hours of our lives at those public, those dog and pony shows, and they are the biggest farce in the world. What they do is they roll out all the department heads. It's a mandatory thing. You have to sit there for like 3 hours. Just sit there like this, make no facial expression, no comment, and people stand there and berate you for 3 hours about what an idiot you are and what a rotten job you're doing, and then everybody goes home and nobody pays the slightest bit of attention to anything that was said.
Democracy in action.
Exactly. So maybe Mayor Emanuel is right to say, screw that. We're not gonna waste the time. I don't know.
Why can't you do both?
What, I mean, have a real process?
I mean, he met with small groups and got, hopefully, some ideas about, you know, what should be in the budget, what should be affected. But I think that even though, you know, it's a kind of messy kind of thing to have these kind of public hearings, I think it gives people perhaps a sense of ownership, a sense of involvement. Who knows? Maybe some little thing is said at those public hearings that, you know, does make somebody at City Hall go, oh, well, maybe we should think about that.
Well, that actually did happen in the Daley years. There would always be one or two little nibbles around the edges of things that were changed because there was huge community opposition. But another time, you were pointing out that another grand tradition has fallen with Mayor Emanuel about how you roll out the budget to the public, not only the public hearings, but the way you're handling the press.
There was no Sun-Time scoop revealing all the details and allowing aldermen and others to be ready to pounce on the mayor's official announcement. The late Harry Golden used to always have this, and Fran Spielman picked up after it. While there were hints in Crane's The Tribune and the Sun-Times about what was about to come out, because that was the frame that the mayor's office clearly wanted to deliver. There were no details until yesterday.
But even though those public hearings, you kind of had preliminary drafts, and so the leak not only went to the press, it went to you had some idea about what was coming.
I think in a democracy, even though it was for show, it's important show. As we saw from a recent presidential debate, you shouldn't just show up. You should fully engage in those opportunities to listen to your public and respond to what they're saying. And I think there's more that could be done with those. If I recall correctly, Harold Washington is who kind of started that model.
That's right.
He did it more specifically
around
Harold controversial.
He just started so much of that.
I mean, I always maintained that Daley too had to govern differently than his dad because of what Harold got done in his 5 short years, and this is another minor legacy. It came out of controversy with council wars on how to spend CDBG money and whatnot, but there was a give and take in those hearings, and I think the way Daley did it, it became less so, and you guys had to put up with 3 hours of
keeping your face straight.
So, Tom, the new news.
Yes.
You guys, this has become like a kind of a tradition now.
We've done 3 of these now over 4 years. And the Chicago Community Trust got concerned when both the Tribune and Sun-Times went into bankruptcy, and around your infamous town hall meeting on the future of newspapers and journalism in February of '09, as I recall.
A long time ago,
there began a discussion about what are citizens going to get the information they need to make good decisions if the sort of public square, that the metaphor I've used over the years for the daily newspaper, even if not every voice was in that square, at least that's where there was conventional wisdom being kind of worked out. And if we're going to lose that because we're all coming into side doors on the internet to get our content now, where's that public discussion going to take place? Because we tend to go where we're comfortable, where we like the content, as opposed to the stuff you might still discover with newsprint that arrives. So we began to study the online experience, and we've looked at this a couple different ways. And in the first year, we were trying to find all those new hyperlocal sites, and there were a lot, and we ranked 60 of them. In the second year, we're looking at operations because, of course, the big issue, whether it's the biggie legacy media outlets or the newer ones, is how's journalism going to survive when advertising and the internet is just killing the old economic models. And what we discovered, not surprisingly, were a lot of kitchen table labors of love that were cookie jar financed. And some of those have already, 2 years later, disappeared. Some have morphed into other forms. So Lorraine Swanson from Lake Effect News, covering the northeast side, is now a patch editor in Oak Lawn. What's patch? Well, that's one of the new phenomenons coming around. AOL, Huffington Post, financed hyperlocal news sites that started in the suburbs, now beginning to move in the city. There's a new actor in town, which we didn't even address because they weren't even around when we started this research this spring, DNA. DNA is hiring local reporters, laid off recently by the Tribune and other places, and they're going to do local news. What we found this year, looking at originally 1,000 sites and then more closely at about 200 and ranking about 50 into 5 different categories, is that the daily newspapers, now more online, still frame a lot of the news agenda. We found that there's a increase in the number of eyes looking at news sites. So that might imply that more public interest in gathering information from these news sources, because they're not all getting it from newsprint coming in their front porch anymore. Right. We found that despite the dominance of the Tribune and the Reader and Chicago Magazine and the Sun-Times in this market, there is continuing to be a vigorous local, hyperlocal news presence and niche and community news. We also discovered something we couldn't measure well, which is how much information people are getting through listservs and other really unconventional sources. In fact, going to a media outlet's homepage is rarely the way people are accessing news anymore. They're getting it because a friend.
It's already passé.
It is.
Yeah.
People send them links.
People are sending them links through Facebook or Twitter, and they're coming in through side doors. They are in a website to get that content eventually, and then often are moving on somewhere else. A sister study by Northwestern.
So the portal notion is almost as obsolete as the newspaper on your front door.
And there's some exceptions. I think HuffPost is one exception, but I'm not even sure they look at themselves as a portal as opposed to kind of a multi-platform delivery device. I'm not sure what language they would use. They now have this HuffPost Live thing, which is kind of like another CNN, MSNBC, Fox kind of cable head thing that's going on online, just out the last couple of weeks. So we all have all this content that I think is difficult to measure, catalog, and figure out exactly what's going on because it continues to very dynamically evolve. One thing that's different about Chicago is that we have not grown up a Chicago News Cooperative, a MinPost or a Texas Observer kind of regional online presence. The legacy papers seem to have kind of hung on to that part of the turf, and the rest of us are doing smaller experiments, still trying to figure out how to pay for it.
Well, you've had, I mean, NPR's had similar kinds of experience. I mean, obviously you are still NP Radio, but you're not really. You're NPR now, and so much of the NPR experience, I'm convinced that people who are 26 years old,
they use they're
using NPR, but they don't know that it's a radio service.
Right, absolutely. The hits or the things from the mobile have gone up tremendously. NPR really started focusing on that early on.
Very early.
Very early.
Yeah.
And it's more than just podcasts. Right?
Oh, yeah, very much so. And they have video and all of that sort of thing, and have won like numerous Webby Awards and all of that. So, so they've been paying attention to this for quite a long time.
What we know we will need, if we get a chance to do this again, is not only to measure the mobile smartphone experience, because that's becoming the platform. While there's still issues about digital divide and undercover communities, and that continues to be an issue that we're doing some work around with the Community Trust, that next generation is kind of conquering the digital divide. They may not have a computer in the home or even broadband access, another initiative the mayor's trying to do something about. But their smartphone is beginning to bridge that divide, because starting with the Fenger High School beating, which is where I became really aware of how there was this other whole thing going on out there. Kids in the North Side knew about that story that night, had the video, were already digesting it literally days before the mainstream media got around to figuring out what was going on.
This recent dust-up with Chief Keef is another example of here's somebody who's getting 1 million hits on his YouTube site, and he's really only known inside the high school, a couple of high schools in Chicago, but it's entirely cell phone or smartphone based, and it's fascinating to watch. I don't want to jump too far afield from this, but I did want to get, while I've got both of you here, I want to ask you about this, about Ed Gardner, Soft Sheen. I just find this to be a fascinating little story that just kind of like erupted out of nowhere. It was fed by, I believe, Mark Brown and later Mary Mitchell at the Sun-Times, but it's a fascinating media and politics nexus that sort of revives some old style.
Yeah. Absolutely, and Chinta Strasberg, former reporter from Chicago Defender, was probably the first one who was putting this out.
Right, that's correct. And she's been doing it on Facebook.
On Facebook and email.
Right.
But Ed Gardner is the founder. He's 87 years old, I think. Founder of Soft Sheen Hair Products. Used a lot of his wealth back in the day to help fund the Harold Washington campaign. And he has kind of been the standard bearer in this latest protest against the lack of jobs for African Americans in the city, primarily and labor jobs on construction sites. So he has gone and had people join him. Almost 1,000, maybe even more at one point, in stopping construction, and said that he would even have held a huge protest at City Hall today, on Thursday, if the mayor had not met with him.
Which Emanuel did.
He did.
Right. Smart enough to know not to mess with that,
so there's some discussions going on about what to do. Exactly, and there's this coalition of African American leaders led by Clarence Wood, who used to be with the Human Relations Office, who was going to kind of try to work with the CTA to talk about jobs on the Red Line. So we're talking about really city projects and having folks work.
What's interesting? I'm sorry. What's interesting about it is that it's not new. I mean, this argument's been going on for decades, but it was just fascinating to me how it just got revived with this.
But think for a moment to nationalize it. What was the major Supreme Court case heard this week?
An
affirmative action court. And the tenor of the discussion, it's sort of like, oh, we don't need this anymore.
Right.
Why are we still? And to me, this story locally is some indication in a diverse city that is noted for its segregated housing patterns that we, in fact, haven't solved this yet.
How can you see African American unemployment so high? I mean, Chicago with the third highest percentage of unemployed African Americans in the country.
And also, Don Turner Trice did a beautiful piece in the Tribune this week about the loss of the middle class, African American middle class. Guys, we're really running very close to the end here, I'm sorry to say, but I do want to mention, Tom, that if people want to get hold of the new news, they can probably the best way is just go to CMW, right?
Come to the communitymediaworkshop.org or chicagonewnews.org. You can also get there through cct.org. That's the Chicago Community Trust. There are many ways. If you Google search it, it actually comes up
I was going to say, just go Google and ask for new news. That's it. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tom. Loved having you. Happy to have back. Anytime, you're welcome back. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. Of course, you can find us right here on cable, but you can also see this program any old time you would like by just going to this address, the one you see right here. You can watch the show anytime. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes. You know that, video and audio podcast. Love to have you join in. I'm Ken Davis, thanking you once again. We will see you next week on Chicago Newsroom. If you'll join us, we'll be right here. We're always here. See you next time. Bye.